What we're seeing right now isn't just a routine spike in tensions. It's a clear shift into a phase where military escalation is becoming more direct, more visible, and more frequent. The pattern has changed. Instead of isolated incidents or indirect pressure, there are now coordinated actions happening across multiple fronts, involving both United States and Israel, with Iran responding in ways that signal it's not backing down. This kind of escalation doesn't happen all at once. It builds. It starts with targeted strikes, often focused on strategic locations like military infrastructure, weapons facilities, or command centers. These aren't symbolic actions. They're designed to weaken capabilities and send a message at the same time. But once those strikes happen, they create pressure on the other side to respond, not just for strategic reasons, but for credibility and internal stability. And that's exactly where things start to intensify. Iran's responses, whether through missiles, drones, or regional proxies, are calculated to show that it still has reach and influence. These responses may not always be symmetrical, but they're enough to keep the cycle going. One move leads to another, and that back and forth begins to accelerate. At the same time, the scale of involvement starts to increase. It's no longer just about a single strike or a single response. Multiple assets are being used, multiple locations are involved, and the operational tempo begins to rise. This creates an environment where incidents are happening closer together, leaving less time for de-escalation between them. What makes this phase especially critical is visibility. Unlike earlier stages, where much of the activity might stay behind the scenes, escalation at this level becomes harder to hide. Movements are tracked, actions are reported, and the global audience starts to take notice. That visibility adds another layer of pressure on all sides, because now actions aren't just being calculated internally, they're being watched and interpreted worldwide. There's also a strategic calculation behind this kind of escalation. It's not just about immediate outcomes, but about shaping the battlefield, both physically and politically, for what could come next. Each move is designed to create an advantage, to shift momentum, or to test how far the other side is willing to go. And as those limits are tested, the margin for error becomes smaller. Because once escalation reaches this level, it's no longer just tension. It's a developing situation where every action carries weight, and every response has the potential to push things even further. What makes this situation even more intense is the ongoing cycle of retaliation, a pattern where one action immediately leads to another, creating a chain reaction that becomes harder to control over time. This isn't a one-time exchange. It's a continuous loop of moves and counter-moves involving Israel and Iran, with the United States closely tied into the equation. It usually starts with a targeted action, a strike, an operation, or a strategic signal. That action is meant to achieve a specific objective, but it also creates an immediate expectation of response. In a region where perception and strength matter deeply, no side wants to appear passive. So a response follows, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect, but always calculated to show capability and resolve. And once that response happens, it doesn't end there. The other side now feels the need to answer back again. That's how the cycle builds. Each step raises the stakes slightly higher than the last. What may have started as a limited action begins to evolve into a broader pattern of engagement, where both sides are trying to stay one step ahead without crossing into full-scale war. One of the most critical aspects of this cycle is speed. The time between action and response gets shorter as tensions rise. Decisions are made faster, reactions come quicker, and there's less space for diplomacy or de-escalation in between. That compression of time increases the risk, because there's less opportunity to fully assess consequences before the next move is made. There's also a psychological layer driving this cycle. Each side is not just reacting militarily, but also signaling strength to its opponent, to its allies, and to its own population. Backing down can be seen as weakness, so even when restraint might be strategically beneficial, the pressure to respond can override it. That keeps the cycle alive. Another important factor is that responses aren't always symmetrical. One side might use direct military force, while the other responds through different channels, proxies, cyber activity, or strategic positioning. That makes the situation more complex, because it's not always clear how actions are connected, even though they are part of the same chain reaction. As this pattern continues, the overall environment becomes more unstable. Each new exchange adds another layer of tension, and the margin for miscalculation gets smaller. What started as controlled responses can gradually shift into something much harder to contain, simply because the cycle itself keeps pushing things forward. What's becoming increasingly clear is that the United States is no longer just observing the situation. It's actively preparing for multiple outcomes at once. And that preparation is showing up in the form of a visible military buildup, not as a sudden surge, but as a steady, deliberate increase in presence across the region. This kind of buildup isn't just about numbers, it's about capability. When additional troops are placed on standby, when naval fleets are moved closer to strategic locations, and when air assets are positioned within rapid reach, it creates a network of readiness that can respond almost instantly. These forces aren't there for show. They're there to ensure that if something happens, there's no delay in action. A big part of this is flexibility. By increasing its presence, the U.S. is giving itself options. It can deter escalation simply by being there, it can support allies if needed, and it can shift into active operations without having to start from scratch. That kind of positioning reduces reaction time dramatically, which is critical in fast-moving situations. At the same time, this buildup sends a message, not just to Iran, but to the entire region. It signals commitment, that the U.S. is paying close attention and is prepared to protect its interests and its allies. That message can act as a deterrent, but it can also raise tensions because it changes how other players calculate their own moves. There's also a logistical side that often goes unnoticed. Supporting a military presence at this level requires coordination on a massive scale. Supply chains, communication systems, intelligence sharing, and constant monitoring. This isn't something that can be put together overnight. It reflects planning that has been in motion for some time, even if it's only now becoming visible. Another key element is coordination with allies. The U.S. doesn't operate in isolation, especially in a region as complex as this. Increased presence often goes hand in hand with joint planning, shared intelligence, and aligned readiness strategies. That means what looks like a single country increasing its footprint is actually part of a broader, more connected system of response. And as this buildup continues, it changes the dynamics of the situation. The environment becomes more reactive, more sensitive, and more closely watched. Every additional move adds another layer of pressure, making the overall situation more intense and more unpredictable. What makes this moment especially complex is that diplomacy hasn't disappeared. It's running in parallel with rising military tension, and that creates a situation where the signals coming out of the region don't always line up. On one side, you hear about potential talks, back-channel communication, and efforts to de-escalate. On the other, you see continued military readiness, positioning, and preparation that suggests something very different. For the United States, this dual-track approach is not unusual. It often keeps diplomatic options open while maintaining pressure through military presence. The idea is to create leverage, to show strength while still leaving room for negotiation. But when both of these strategies are happening at the same time, it becomes harder to read the true direction of the situation. From the perspective of Iran, the messaging can be equally layered. Public statements may reject negotiations or deny any ongoing communication, while behind the scenes, indirect channels could still be active through intermediaries. This allows leadership to maintain a strong public stance while quietly exploring options that avoid further escalation. The result is a landscape filled with mixed signals. One day, reports suggest progress toward talks. The next day, those reports are denied or contradicted. Officials may confirm certain details while avoiding others, and different sources can present completely different narratives. This constant shift makes it difficult to separate what's strategic messaging from what's actually happening. For analysts and decision-makers, this lack of clarity creates a serious challenge. Every signal has to be interpreted, but no signal can be taken at face value. Is a diplomatic statement genuine, or is it meant to buy time? Is a military move defensive, or is it preparation for something more? These questions don't always have clear answers, and that uncertainty affects how each side plans its next move. there's also a risk that these mixed signals lead to misinterpretation. A move intended to de-escalate might be seen as weakness. A defensive action might be read as a step toward aggression. And when decisions are made based on those interpretations, the situation can shift quickly in unintended ways. At the same time, the flow of information adds to the complexity. Media reports, unofficial leaks, and political statements all contribute to a constantly evolving narrative. For an American audience, it can feel like the story is changing in real time. One moment suggesting calm, the next suggesting escalation. That shifting picture reflects just how fluid and uncertain the situation has become. What's important to understand is that the impact of rising tensions between United States, Israel, and Iran doesn't stay contained within the region. It immediately starts affecting the global system in ways that are both visible and subtle. One of the first areas to react is the energy market. Oil prices are extremely sensitive to instability in the Middle East, especially when there's even a slight risk to major supply routes like the Strait of Hormuz. A large percentage of the world's oil passes through this narrow corridor, so any tension involving Iran raises concerns about potential disruption. Even if nothing has actually been blocked or attacked, the fear alone is enough to push prices upward, sometimes within hours. That price movement doesn't just affect traders, it ripples outward. Higher oil prices can lead to increased fuel costs, which then impact transportation, manufacturing, and everyday goods. For consumers in the U.S., that might show up as higher gas prices or rising costs at the store. For businesses, it means adjusting budgets, supply chains, and pricing strategies to deal with the uncertainty. Shipping is another critical area. Tankers and cargo vessels operating near high-risk zones face increased insurance premiums and tighter security requirements. Some companies may choose to reroute shipments entirely to avoid potential threats, which adds both time and cost to global trade. These changes don't stay isolated. They affect delivery times, inventory levels, and ultimately the availability of products across different markets. Air travel also feels the pressure. Airlines closely monitor geopolitical risks, and when tensions rise, they often alter flight paths to avoid certain airspaces. That can lead to longer routes, increased fuel consumption, and operational challenges. While passengers may only notice delays or slightly higher ticket prices, behind the scenes, airlines are constantly adapting to maintain safety and efficiency. There's also a broader financial impact. Global markets tend to react quickly to uncertainty, and geopolitical tension is one of the biggest drivers of volatility. Investors may shift towards safer assets, stock markets can fluctuate, and economic confidence can take a hit. Governments and central banks start paying closer attention, sometimes adjusting policies to prepare for potential economic shocks. Beyond the numbers, there's a psychological effect that spreads across industries and decision-makers. When uncertainty becomes the dominant factor, businesses become more cautious, investments slow down, and long-term planning becomes more difficult. Even without a direct conflict, the atmosphere of tension alone can influence how economies behave, creating a more defensive and unpredictable global environment. What makes this phase especially dangerous is the level of uncertainty surrounding every move, every statement, and every reaction. When tensions reach this point, it's no longer about clear strategies or predictable outcomes. It's about navigating a situation where multiple possibilities exist at the same time, and none of them can be ruled out. For countries like the United States, Israel, and Iran, that means operating in an environment where decisions have to be made quickly, often without complete information. One of the biggest risks in this kind of environment is miscalculation. When intelligence is incomplete or signals are unclear, there's always a chance that one side interprets a move incorrectly. A defensive action might look offensive. A precaution might be seen as preparation for attack. And once that interpretation takes hold, the response that follows is based on that perception, not necessarily on the original intention. Another factor is how compressed the timeline becomes. In lower tension situations, there's usually time to analyze, communicate, and de-escalate. But when forces are already positioned and on high alert, that time disappears. Decisions can be executed within hours, sometimes minutes. That speed increases the pressure on leadership, because there's less room for hesitation and fewer opportunities to correct a mistake once it's in motion. There's also the issue of chain reactions. In a highly sensitive environment, even a small incident, a warning shot, a sudden movement, a misinterpreted signal, can trigger a much larger response. That response then leads to another, and before long, the situation escalates beyond what any side originally intended. It's not always a single big decision that causes escalation. Sometimes it's a series of smaller reactions that build on each other. Communication, which should ideally reduce risk, often becomes strained during these moments. Official statements may be limited, delayed, or strategically vague. Back-channel communication might exist, but it's not always strong enough to prevent misunderstandings in real time. That gap in communication increases the likelihood that actions will be judged based on assumptions rather than facts. There's also pressure from both domestic and international audiences. No country wants to appear weak or unprepared, especially under global scrutiny. That pressure can influence how quickly decisions are made and how aggressively they're executed. It's not just about military strategy. It's also about maintaining credibility, alliances, and influence on the world stage. As all of these factors come together, uncertainty, speed, pressure, and limited communication, the situation becomes extremely sensitive. Every move carries weight, every response has consequences, and the margin for error becomes very small. In this kind of environment, stability is fragile, and even a minor disruption has the potential to shift everything in a completely different direction.